Thank you so much for joining us as we host the next installment of the 2022-23 academic year's East Asia by the Book, CS Author Talk series, sponsored by the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. My name is Chelsea Foxwell, and I'm Associate Professor in the Departments of Art History and East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at the University of Chicago. The Center for East Asian Studies, also known by its acronym CS, is a U.S. Department of Education designated National Resource Center at the University of Chicago. CS supports a variety of activities on campus and beyond to promote teaching, research, interdisciplinary scholarship, and greater public understanding related to the study of China, Korea, and Japan. For more information on the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies, as well as the East Asia by the Book Author Talks series, please visit the CS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. The links are provided in the chat box. Tonight's program is co-sponsored with the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, the center's long-term partner and first non-for-profit bookstores whose mission is book selling. We're encouraging book sales for this event to be made through Seminary Co-op. We encourage you to visit their website and help support this unique cultural institution. Learn more about the Seminary Co-op by visiting the link provided in the chat. And a link to purchase tonight's book will also be made available in the chat. Before I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers, I'd like to remind you that we'll have a Q&A session following tonight's presentation. To ask a question to be addressed, please be sure to type your questions in the Q&A box. I'll get started introducing tonight's participants. So our speaker, Han Saucy, is University Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations and the Committee on Social Thought here at the University of Chicago. His work brings the lessons of classical and modern rhetoric to bear on several periods, languages, disciplines, and cultures. Professor Saucy's primary teaching and research interests include classical Chinese poetry and commentary, literary theory, the comparative study of oral traditions, problems of translation, and the ethics of medical care in resource-poor settings. He's published and edited numerous books, to name just a few: The Problem of a Chinese Aesthetic, 1993, Partner to the Poor of Paul Farmer Reader, 2010, Translation as Citation, Zhuangzi Inside Out, and Are We Comparing Yet? On Standards, Justice, and Incomparability of 2019. While engagement with China is primary, Professor Saucy recognizes that understanding any culture arises from comparison with other times, places, belief systems, political orders, and forms of communication. Comparative literature, he feels, is the place in the modern university where this activity finds its natural home. And I'm delighted to also introduce our discussant, Martin Powers. Professor Martin Powers is a Professor Emeritus in the History of Art and formerly Sally Michelson Davidson Professor of Chinese Arts and Cultures at the University of Michigan. Professor Powers' research focuses on the role of visual culture in the history of social justice, with special attention to political theory and practice. His first two books won the Levinson Prize for Best Book in pre-1900 Chinese Studies in 1993 and in 2006. And I believe those are the first one, Art and Political Expression in Early China, and the 2006 book, Pattern and Person, Ornament, Society, and Self in Classical China, 2006. And in 2009, he was a fellow in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And together with Dr. Catherine Zhang, he co-edited Looking at Asian Art and the Blackwell Companion to Chinese Art. His most recent book is China and England, The Pre-Industrial Struggle for Justice in Word and Image, published by Routledge in 2019, which you can also get at the Seminary Co-op. So I'm delighted to be able to hand the floor over to Professor Saucy and Professor Powers.
Okay, good morning. Let me say, first of all, I felt privileged to have been asked to comment on Han Saucy's book. Han Saucy, in my mind, is one of a limited number of voices of reason in an increasingly fraught field of study these days. Let me try to share my screen. Does that work?
It does. Sharing is
Wow.
caring.
Okay. So yeah, and the title, as you'll see, is itself very interesting. I mean, you need to read the book to understand what the title is saying. So what I'd like to do today primarily, hopefully not take too much time, is first of all to provide some background that might be useful if you're thinking of purchasing this book, and just give you a little bit of background. It appears at a very timely moment. So it's a very timely book. And secondly, to give you some sense of some of the virtues of the book. I can't do them all. Professor Saucy's prose style, I might say, is completely lucid and free of jargon. It's easy to read, but the ideas are thick. So it's a book that will make you think. There are insights on almost every page, so beware of that. By way of background, I want to talk a bit about the context in which the book appears on the market. And just to explain, in Zoom, it's very hard to use presenter notes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard to use presenter notes. So I put them on the screen. So yeah, just bear with me. So until recent decades, the consensus among Western sinologists was that in imperial China, ethnic difference was perceived as cultural rather than racial. And so these are some of the terms that have been used around these kinds of topics. And I think almost on the first page, Professor Saucy says, well, you know, the terms we've been working with, democratic, authoritarian, whatever, you know, aren't working for us anymore. We need to find new terms. So I want to point out that these have been the terms. Joseph Levinson held that view, and even John King Fairbank maintained that opinion. And there are reasons for that. And I want you to know that there were reasons why that was the consensus. As early as the 3rd century BC, future statesman Li Si actually wrote a policy document arguing that ethnic or national difference shouldn't be a factor in official appointments. Mozi had made that point centuries earlier, but in this particular case, his essay was entered into an 11th century compilation of exemplary essays, and that compilation remained popular for the rest of imperial history. So this position was considered normative. I can't think of any similar scenario for England. Certainly in early modern England, you had to be noble, you had to be Anglican, and you had to be English to wield authority of any sort. During the Han Dynasty, 1 in 12 chancellors was non-Han Chinese, and in the wall paintings, I think we see evidence of ethnic diversity. Certainly that's well recorded. By the 10th century, the aristocracy had collapsed. Now, I want to point out that aristocracies function a bit like fascist systems by ranking people according to groups, ethnic, religious, lineage, which means wealth, and so on. After the 10th century in China, the civil service examinations were purposely made anonymous so as to reduce the influence of family lineage, ethnicity, wealth, or religion in the selection of officials. Now, I understand that ethnicity is somewhat anachronistic, but they knew what they were talking about. No similarly egalitarian measures would be adopted in England, at any rate, before the 20th century. Gladstone did reform the civil service system along Chinese lines, allowing commoners into the system without patronage, but I believe foreigners were still excluded. The imperial, that is the late imperial conception from after 10th century of political authority was based on performance, not on blood. And this theoretically was so for the emperor, whose position was dependent on performance. That's why Sung emperors wore official hats, not crowns, and unornamented clothing. The problem of why they get fancy clothing later on, I'm going to leave aside. That would get us off topic. Yeah, as you can see, Charles here Lots of fancy carving. He's got his coat of arms here, proof of his lineage, right, as well as his aristocratic rank. There's a Saint Anthony, I believe, here. So he has divine approbation, so on. None of that is there in the Chinese case. This looks like the chair in my kitchen, okay, here in Beijing, rather than a throne. And religion also, all religions were tolerated in post-Tang China. We often see pictures of representatives of the three religions chatting together, whereas, of course, in Europe, it would be just St. Thomas is on top here. Muhammad has been subjugated, literally subjugated below, along with other heretics. So this is not because the Chinese are more open-minded, it's because it was a post-feudal system. Similar things start to happen in Europe after the French Revolution. And again, in Song painting, we find evidence of ethnic diversity. I don't think this guy is Han Chinese or that one either, and maybe not that one either. And of course, in the States today, a foreign person can obtain an influential position in America if she passes the GREs, SITs, gets into a good US university, writes her dissertation in English, and so on. It was somewhat similar in Song Mingqing, China. Jews, Muslims, Khitans, and other non-Han persons who could do that could get appointed. I want to point out also that the notion that races are ontologically separate is of a piece with the idea that classes are ontologically separate. These tend to go together in aristocratic systems. It's all articulated very clearly in the opening pages of Aristotle's Politics, where it makes it clear that a commoner, even a wealthy one, well, there's no such thing as an intelligent commoner for him. They cannot participate in politics. And you can see this in this painting. Notice that the servant does not dare to look at her mistress, and she covers her hands because her hands might be dirty or rough and would be offensive to her mistress. So she has to do that. Again, in post-Tang China, if you could get an education, you could be appointed. So the other context, however, is that consensus began to be contested in the late 90s. Scholars like Frank de Coetter and James Hargett began to argue that racism was actually characteristic of Chinese culture. Xiang Shuchan has done a pretty good job deconstructing that, but nonetheless, the voices have become louder in the past 5 or 6 years as China has come to be seen as a national security problem. The project, and here's where I get to this. So this is where Han's book makes its debut, okay, in this highly contested realm. And the project that those scholars pursue is precisely not what Professor Saucy's book aspires to. But if you come to the book with those preconceptions, you might easily misread it. So I want to give you a little advice along those lines, and just remind you again first that in aristocratic systems, because of the way aristocracies work, there tends to be an emphasis on ethnic difference, on class difference, on wealth, and so on. And so many of Professor Saucy's examples in the book come precisely from those periods in China which were aristocratic, where China was ruled by an aristocracy. And so those examples fit that topic better. Here you can see, for example, this is an 8th century painting with angels on the top, a deity in the middle. The blessings of the deity go down to this aristocrat, the emperor, on the bottom. This is a Titian where we see angels and clouds on the top, just like here. You see a deity in the middle, the Christ child, a churchman who transmits that power down to the Duke. It's almost identical, and yet the two artists knew nothing about one another. The parallels are due to the fact that it was a similar kind of social formation. There's a reason why Professor Saucy chose most of his examples from the aristocratic periods, and that's because, as he explains, and as I'll discuss later, he's kind of going against the grain. He wants to look at those things that are less normative in a way, because that will reveal things that we don't normally see. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. So now to the book. Professor Saucy accomplishes many things in the book. I couldn't cover it all, but I would like to single out 5 for attention. First, although it takes Imperial China as its focus, the book maintains an ongoing comparison with more recent events, which you may pick up early on. The attentive reader will find in many of Saucy's descriptions of China language that sounds a lot like contemporary American practice. So, for example, this one, it seems to me that the language hang on, I'm going to have to pull this down a bit. Here we go. Oops. This is Han speaking. It seems to me that the language of international relations wielded by Emperor Wen's officials predetermines the outcome of the dialogue. And of course, that's true. The terms themselves are so heavily loaded with connotations, right? As the source of virtue, beneficence, justice, it's hard to imagine framing a correct answer that wouldn't be a capitulation. Of course, if you imagine negotiating with President Biden's foreign policy group, you know, they start out with the idea, okay, you guys are authoritarian and we're democratic, right? And so where do you go from there? And I do believe that Professor Saucy had that in mind. What he's really looking for is what is a fairer way to do this? Instead of loading the dice from the beginning, how do we deal with cultural difference in a more cosmopolitan way? Again, he says a further testimony to the power of Chinese writing is that the earliest recorded history of all the peoples of the area is to be found not in the local language, but in ethnographic sections of Chinese dynastic histories with all the biases that one might expect. That's true. But in saying this, of course, Professor Saucy is undermining a common claim in post-colonial studies that one of the reasons Europeans are so great is because they were the first to write the histories of the people they colonized, right? You very often come across it, gee, it's really awful that we colonized those people. But then, you know, in the end, we gave them ideas they could think with because they didn't have any ideas before that. So what Professor Saucy is showing here is, well, no, it's not just Europeans who did that. There are other people who were doing that maybe even earlier. Again, quoting, Chinese sources do acknowledge contributions from the periphery, but if we were to trust the conventional literary histories of China, such contributions were only marginal and superficial, not affecting the mainstream. And of course, this is the common refrain coming from European historians when they deal with Chinese influence on the Enlightenment or Middle Eastern influence on the Enlightenment and so on. They always dismiss it as peripheral. So again, this is a practice which is not peculiar to China, and is very much alive today. And the book eventually makes that perfectly clear. And again, the reader who comes to the material with the prejudices informing the last 6-7 years of China bashing might imagine that all this confirms her biases. But in the conclusion, Professor Saucy reveals clearly the purpose of the running comparison. The task of recovering a multilingual pre-modern Asia involves chipping away at 2 totalizing world pictures, the familiar one of East-West polarity and the older one of Chinese imperial centrality. We got similar problems in both cases. So how can we use these 2 examples to maybe come up with a fairer approach? Secondly, Professor Saucy wants to theorize the role of an empire of ideas. So one of the things that, again, is kind of special about China, about the Roman Empire, about the British Empire, about the American Empire, is that all of them created an empire of ideas that other people made use of, in fact, had to make use of. So he wants to theorize this both then and now. Although he attends mostly to the Chinese case, we're always aware that the phenomenon he describes is very much part of contemporary American practice. So he says a great deal of recent translation theory has turned on the position of English or global English. I feel that these discussions are hobbled by the failure to articulate something adequately general. What in general is the role of a dominant monolingual culture? Of course, the reason they don't attend to it in a general way is because they think that this is the only case, There is no other case but global English. But Professor Saucy shows, well, no, there is another case. There may be even several other cases. So we need to theorize this on a higher plane and not just use it as an example of exceptionalism. Thirdly, he wants to theorize this phenomenon outside the standard categories, such as racism. I don't even know if the word appears, maybe once or twice. But what kind of difference does he indicate? It may look like ethnic or racial difference, though we need to be careful about the danger of projecting backward in time concepts that are unavailable to our predecessors. So he tries to do this in a much more nuanced way instead of just falling in line with the usual categories. Fourth, so granting, I think, that China shows little evidence for Aristotelian ontologically based racism, such as we find in the European case, still exclusionary social practices and institutions develop. So Professor Saucy wants to understand how those practices exclude and what would be gained from including more of the voices that have been excluded. So he puts it this way: civilizations each manufacture their own barbarians. So here we come to realize for the first time, or perhaps you will have figured it out sooner, that barbarian in this book is not a translation for Hu. If it were, I would probably contest it, and some other people might. I believe that Han is using the term here as an analytical term, in a higher analytical plane. Barbarian for him is not just a translation for whatever word the Greeks used, because that was very different from Hu, but is a category, is an analytical category, which allows us to focus on whatever way a particular civilization chooses to create a systemic difference and to enforce that difference in language. So, which I think is one of the real accomplishments of the book, though no doubt there will be lots of discussion around that. Many of the recent studies purporting to find evidence of racism in China strongly insinuate, with unintended irony, that the reason you find exclusionary practices in China is because the Chinese are racist, okay? But Professor Saucy instead looks for structural factors that might apply in many times and places. So he tells cultural exclusivity is a typical move in struggles for authority among policy groups and schools of thought at times when outsiders were considered a threat. And I might actually ask here, could maybe one rearrange that? Cultural exclusivity is a typical move in struggles for authority among policy groups, such that it becomes useful to consider outsiders to be a threat. Mm-hmm. And finally, he seems to suggest that translation studies can contribute to a new kind of study. He's very modest about this, but I think that's what he's arguing. He says we need to do more with translation, or we can do more than we have done. One in which the analysis of translation serves a larger purpose than it had previously. The goal of comparative study, it seems to me, is finding counterexamples, edges and bits of texture that fall somewhat out of frame. They enable us to see the frame as a frame. And I think this is why he's concentrated mainly on classical and medieval texts, because that's not what we normally we associate with China. It's late imperial China that we think of as China. But by looking in these periods, we can see more clearly some of the things that don't fit the rule and begin to theorize them. And so in case you missed the running comparison throughout the book, the author makes it clear towards the end. While tracing the spatial and temporal boundaries of Chinese civilization, we were also reminded of the limits of other proposed world systems. To generalize somewhat, exclusionary concepts with a basis in teleologies of group identity create, or worse, motivate zones of ignorance or monolingualism. So this is an issue that deserves thought and perhaps some solutions, some suggested solutions. So to put it otherwise, translation studies help us to identify and critique otherwise unquestioned master narratives. He adds, it is the reward of comparison, but also its first step to be able to chart such horizons and propose alternatives to self-evident truth. And I think that the book does a very good job of that, and very much merits close consideration. So if we can see the classical Chinese frame as a frame, then we also can see contemporary American frame as a frame. In either case, that vision will enable us to rethink relations between culturally different peoples in a more critical and perhaps in a more cosmopolitan way. Now, I'd just like to offer one question, really, with three facets to it, about the universalism versus exceptionalism issue, because I'd like Professor Saucy to unpack that a bit more. There is a universalism trap, of course, if you assume that you're finding a similar idea in two different cultures amounts to a claim for universalism, then you end up with solipsism. So that could be a problem. So as he puts it at one point, to assert that the Chinese phrases merely came to give new form to moral intuitions that pre-existed Chinese literacy in Korea, Japan, might bring comfort to local pride, but at the same time seem to confirm the universality and inevitability of ideas that do, after all, as far as we know, have a particular place and time of origin. So I don't think Professor Saucy is doing this, but one could argue that this seems to presume a kind of essentialism, as if no idea, as if an idea that occurs in two places, if an idea occurs in two places, then you're making a claim for universalism. Let me give an example. The Marxists among you will be familiar with the work of Marc Bloch, who wrote the classic work on feudalism. And in that book, he concludes with a list of 6 features, typical features of feudalism as he sees it. In the 9th century, Liu Zongyuan wrote an essay on feudalism. He doesn't give us a list, but he hits 5 of those, okay? So he hits 5 of those features and he identifies them. There's no way that Liu Zongyuan knew anything about Marc Bloch, and I doubt that Marc Bloch knew about Liu Zongyuan. I don't think that had been translated at that time. So, so how do we deal with that, right? Another way to think of it, is it possible to imagine something in between universal and unique? Could some ideas be common or perennial, perhaps even, if not universal? And finally, is it possible that some ideas might be more fungible than others, simply because they're more capable of solving problems that are common to the human condition? Might that perhaps create conditions for the adaptation of foreign ideas as opposed to simply having them imposed? So anyway, I throw that out for Professor Saucy and thank him for giving me the opportunity to read this very provocative book.
Thank you so much, Marty. I'll turn it over to Han now.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. That was a very perceptive X-ray of my book, and I think you definitely went to the bone in many places. A couple of things to throw out. The scale on which I'm trying to frame the argument is usually not the scale of what the Chinese thought, but it's almost always, at least I try to specify, that it's one or another group that is contending for dominance within China. And
that's true.
So there's a kind of an irony there, because people like Levinson and Fairbank, on whose books I was raised, this was sort of the pablum that I was fed on as a baby sinologist. They seem to be articulating something very admirable, that in China, ethnicity, your race was not your definitive verdict of your worth as a human being, but people could acquire worth by education and then move up in the hierarchy, and it was open in that way. I found that extremely admirable. But as I got more deeply into it, I noticed that the people who were the gatekeepers of the hierarchy generally were the Confucian scholars, and they could be just as jealous and provincial as anybody else. So it really amounted to a kind of a resituating of the question of, Is it inborn or is it acquired? Is it nature or is it nurture? And I discovered that, at least in this case in China, you could have a situation where people said the essential thing is nurture, and yet they could also be extremely restrictive in what kinds of statements and what kinds of behaviors they would admit as cultured. The great example being, Han Yu, who just, unleashes his rhetoric on the Buddhists at many points. And one of his main arguments is that, of course, the Buddha did not have the good fortune to be born in the Central Kingdom, right? And so I was perplexed by that, because Han Yu is in many other ways a very admirable writer. And a couple of recent books by Jonathan Scaffin and Yang Shaoyun helped me understand that, in fact, what's called the Guwen Yundong, right, the archaizers movement, they see as a movement of ethnic resistance to both Buddhism, which was coming from outside, and to the basically Turkish aristocracy that was dominant in the Tang. So they were trying to make a place for themselves in Tang China in which they could dominate, resisting these two groups that had equally good claims, if you put it against an absolute background, equally good claims to authority, but they had to be somehow pushed off the road. So that helped me a lot, to understand that it's not eternal China that's doing this, but it's, Han Yu and some of his confederates, and then everybody else who reads Han Yu, because his work gets canonized quite early and everyone is reading it over the centuries and thinking that this is a model essay, this is how you argue, this is the way things are done. So in that way, a precedent got founded. And so I was kind of tracing what happens when one group wants to maintain a monopoly over authority when it's challenged. And so that's why that kind of brittle definition of who's inside and who's outside came to be. But, from very early on, there were millions and millions of people who did not belong to the ethnic group that considered themselves Chinese in, let's say, the year 220 of the Common Era, just to take the end of the Han Dynasty as a convenient baseline. Millions and millions of people became Chinese by assimilating in a behavioral way, and by sitting for the exams, and by ascending in this relatively open world of intellect. And that became a problem for later people who wanted for there to be an ethnic test. You have these essays about expelling the barbarians that keep on being written from the Jin dynasty onwards. And it becomes a completely impossible project, right? It's unmixing the mayonnaise. How do you get the eggs out of the olive oil in your mayonnaise? It's too late. But some people clearly thought that this was a worthy task. And I even found an echo of them in Li Ji of the 1920s. His thesis, which he wrote at a moment when the anthropology department at Harvard, where he got his degree, was run by some profoundly racist people who actually believe that the history of the world is the history of races. And so, given this analytic equipment, he tried to figure out who are the true Chinese. And there's some criteria about how wide your head is and how long your nose is and so on. Stuff that looks completely absurd to us, and in fact actually sinister, since the example of
well, those are European ideas.
Politics. Yeah. Since 1945, we really can't talk about that kind of thing anymore. But anyway, Li Ji was attempting to do something that people had done over and over again, always unsuccessfully. So that kind of struck me. So anyway, the notion of culture as your way in seemed more appealing. And, if we wanted to go over to the Western side, well, you've got English colonialism, which is largely exclusive, right? One doesn't mix with the natives. And French colonialism, which is a little bit more open. Again, not a lot more open, slightly more open, but in that semantic world, maybe the French model of colonialism looks like, something free and equal. It's not, of course, but given the calipers that we have in our hand, it might look like something more honest. So anyway, these kinds of questions interested me very much. And I'm glad that you talk about cosmopolitanism, because I always feel that the language in which we can talk about cosmopolitanism, talk about things from a cosmopolitan point of view, is kind of still in the future, right? We don't really have it because our languages are always provincial and we're being dragged back into them always. And then a last note to talk about the universal. I think of the universal kind of in the way that somebody like Karl Popper thought about truth, right? A statement is not true. You merely say it's true as a kind of a placeholder for saying, so far, this statement has not been invalidated. And I think, if you wanted to say, okay, I read the Epic of Gilgamesh, mourning for one's friend. Oh, that is a universal. But there's a culture out there where people don't mourn for their friends and where mourning for your friend might be a scandalous and unethical thing. But if you don't know about that, you can still use the word universal. So my true love is always for the counterexamples, the things that say, you thought you knew what you were talking about, but look here, it's not the same. So those are some of the things that I would want to raise as answers to some of your questions. And I want to talk briefly, just by way of mentioning, about a great predecessor whom everybody ignores. This is a guy named Giuseppe Ferrari, who writes a book in 1848, a rather important year in European history. He writes a book, History and European History, in which every important development in European history is preceded by the Chinese with an interval of about 200 years. Galileo says, I don't care what the church says, science is telling me what the truth is. Following about 250 years after Wang Anshi, who says, I don't care what the classics say, we have to re-examine everything from the beginning, and so on. Anyway, for the whole history of recorded time, Ferrari is finding these parallels in which you go to China to find out what will happen 200 years from now in Europe. And it's a beautiful book, partly because it was written at a moment when everyone in Europe was reading Hegel as the authority for how history works, right? It's progress towards a certain goal, and that goal is to be found in Prussian monarchy. Everything else is kind of a preparatory stage, and boy, the Chinese are way, way back there. You would never seek inspiration from the Chinese for the future if you were reading Hegel. But Ferrari, he has tons of evidence. He's a much better read person than Hegel, at least as far as East Asian history is concerned, and he has some very provocative parallels to propose. And sadly, because the audience was not ready, there wasn't a public that could assimilate this thing. Ferrari's book just fell completely by the wayside. Nobody reads it, but I read it, and I want you to read it, and I want everybody to read it. Anyway,
will you translate it for us?
Okay, sure. Let's see. How much time have you got? It's 605 pages long. I'll get started right now. Anyway, it's a great book. I wrote an article once summarizing it and telling people why it was great. But maybe in my copious spare time, I'll sit down and translate it, because it is a really insightful and at times a little bit crazy book, because he's got a system and he wants to fit the examples into the system. But anyway, so in my book, there are also the counterexamples to the examples, and I want to emphasize them a little bit, because we've been talking about the Confucians who are resentful of outsiders, of people who don't follow our way. And there are also people who are, for one reason or another, pushed to the margins of empire and say, you know what, you can live this way. It's okay. I can be very comfortable here, right? Like Su Shi, he's exiled to Hainan at a time when Hainan was the place where you were most likely to catch malaria and die within a few months, and he was lucky. And he made friends. He took seriously the culture of the people who live there. He still wanted to preach to them that they should become more like the Chinese and cultivate grain and pay taxes and so on. But aside from that, he was very welcoming to the culture of the local people. And at times he even fantasized that he would cast aside his Chinese identity and become one of them. I mean, I think that's kind of a fantasy, sort of like Kafka fantasizing about becoming a red Indian, but it's a beautiful fantasy while it lasts. And the fact that he could have that fantasy is important. A couple of hundred years later, there's a Taoist sage who goes through what's now Mongolia and Kazakhstan and other places, writing little comments on the locals, and he's very appreciative. He has nothing ugly to say about these people. He doesn't say that their cuisine is awful, or that they look wrong, or they smell bad, or they have scandalous marriage practices. He just kind of watches it and says, yeah, these people they're doing their own thing. And he uses the phrase "zuyo," which of course for us 20th century people is very polarizing and coded, right? There are those who have zuyo and those who don't, one thinks. And yet here, this guy is saying, yeah, these people who are living nomadically up on the borders, what they have is zuyo, and basically the right to be left alone, as Justice Brandeis would have said 100 or so years ago. So it's a very rich series of kind of somewhat frustrated dialogues with the outside that I was trying to pull up and bring together and just show, the people who are really cathected on, excuse the jargon, right? The people who are really attracted to hierarchy and stable group identity, who might sometimes be the Confucians. These are the people who want to give the least leeway to the outsiders to be worthy members of the human race, right? And in times, or in cases where individuals are more relaxed about that kind of thing, they're more welcoming. And so those are the people that I want to throw flowers at. And I hope I successfully threw some rhetorical flowers into their laps as I went on my way. But anyway, it's a book that, I would absolutely hate it if people said, oh, this book proves that the Chinese are, racist and ethnocentric.
No, I know you did not intend that.
Yeah. There were always ethnocentric people, but there was also always a struggle and a contest among them and other people who had other priorities. And that, in fact, gives me the opportunity to talk about your book, China and England, because you have such a wonderful way of showing, not just through text, but through visual evidence, how the way of thinking, the mode of reasoning that's specific to group identity hierarchy versus the mode of thinking that's specific to thinking about individuals occupying an office, or individuals addressing particular criteria works. And, the book is very deep in that way. It's, I think, if I may say so without slander, I think, like me, you're looking to the 18th century and the 17th century for models of what we're confronted with today, that, and hoping that by reflecting on those predecessors, we can think better through our own present day muddle. There's just so many great passages to draw out. I'm going to cede to the temptation to pull out a couple. Here, close to the end of the book, you say, if tyranny is the unlawful abuse of state power, treated as a personal privilege, that reminds me of somebody. I don't remember who. Then the containment of privilege requires eliminating group membership as a criterion for assigning value. Amen. If that is so, how then should that insight itself be understood as a product of group membership, right? This is the really brilliant moment where you get to the paradox that in some discussions that I'm familiar with, has to do with secularism, right? People talk about secularism, but their model for secularism comes from a particular path that has been trod by people living in basically Christian societies who could imagine an alternative to a church-dominated society, but people who had begun from a different starting point, if they were to generate a secularism, might do so in a very different way. And so the problem happens when people who are coming to secularism at the end of one path think that they've got the end for all people coming from all paths. And, it is just immensely challenging, but this is the problem that intrigues me. How can we find a language that will communicate across the pathways of different histories?
Yeah, that was a fairly Saucian passage you chose there.
Yeah, I guess it is. Well, I'm in love with paradoxes because these are always the things that make you say, wait a minute, I thought
Yeah,
I
like
knew
what?
something, but now I'm sent back to zero.
You're right.
Anyway, but there are many passages here that are just terrific, and your use of Wilkes, who is not a household name but should be, as a person who is, despite enormous opposition and physical punishment, civic punishment, all kinds of punishment, nonetheless maintaining equality in a very hierarchical world of England. His example is great. And so there are many things here that everyone can, I think, gain from reading. And England too. Let's think about England as a land of paradox, because it's a place where you have, a very powerful monarchy, and yet you have a powerful parliament that's contending with monarchy. Right? And Parliament is not the land of equality either, right? Most people bought their way into Parliament, but it's a counterpower. You think of the French parliaments, for example, which were totally revocable on the whim of the monarch. They were merely talking shops. The British Parliament had actual power, the power of the purse.
You remember Tom Paine, though, was highly skeptical of the checking powers of the British Parliament.
Yeah, as you might expect him to be. And England, it's got all the mechanisms of exclusivity in place. And yet, in the 1840s, they come up with a prime minister who is of Jewish extraction, right? Long before anybody else in any other country did. When the Jews were still seen as sort of the quasi-pariahs, the people who are tolerated but not welcomed or accepted. And, how can that happen in England? Well, it has to do with the paradoxes of class in that one instance, overriding questions of religion and race. So anyway, I love those moments, though, because these are the counterexamples that show you, what the rule is that is being violated.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you got some things out of that, and again, I'm grateful for your comments. I think we do share many values and interests, and I look forward to learning more from your next book, which you'll probably finish in a half a year or something.
I don't know. The thing about books is that, it's always, as Sima Qian said, fa fen er zuo, right? You've got something that's just got to come out, and so you sit down and write it. And anyway, so this book is actually the preface to a much longer book where I'm trying to unseat national literary histories from their dominant position and get people who know things that I don't know, people who know Burmese or Thai or Vietnamese or Mongolian and so on, to write a kind of collective literary history about border crossing ideas, forms, motifs, whatever, that will, counteract the sense that, the national history is always the only history that you need to know. So this is just sort of my personal preface to that book. And I hope I am able to organize people to do it. I hope I live long enough to get it on the way. But that's where the real emphasis should lie.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Should we open it up to the audience?
Let's do. Let's see. Good Lord, there are 83 beautiful people here. Hello, beautiful people. Let's hear from you. If not, I can always talk for another hour or two.
Well, I could add something too. I think there is another factor in cases like Hanyu and actually Shen Kuo. Also, Shen Kuo, there's a quote in my book of one of what I think is one of his most brilliant passages, where he identifies what aristocracy is, and he acknowledges that China went through this between the end of the Han and the end of the Tang. He blames it on the foreigners, right? He says it was basically imported by the way. No. But his real concern, though, is the tyrannical effects of Fengjian, of feudalism. No. So and this was true, I think, for Hanyu also.
Mm.
And in fact, when Su Dongpo, so in other words, it's not simply that the Chinese sages are right because they were Chinese. I actually have never come across that. They were right because they had a system that was fairer. And it was fairer because it wasn't aristocratic. So Liu Zongyuan's Fengjian Lun is all about that and why a post-feudal system is fairer. And then Su Dongpo, as you know, wrote a eulogy for Han Yu. And in that, he addresses the problem of the Buddhist and Taoist sects. And of course, he uses the word Yiduan, but in context, it's very clear that that doesn't mean unorthodox. I think that's a bad translation. It means irrational. In other words, that their arguments cannot be subjected to facts and logic because it comes from God. It comes from the Buddha, or it comes from the Tao, or it's mystical or something. And I think you'll find that this is, at least in some of these discussions of foreigners, the underlying concern is not whether you're pure Chinese or not pure Chinese, but is a political concern. In other words, you'll recall that when Su Dongpo talks about feudalism, this is in a Zhouzhang to the emperor, he says, basically, for God's sake, don't let this come back, okay? He says, we had this system for 1,000 years, and for God's sake, don't let this happen again. This is really bad news. And I think Americans can sympathize with that. We also think of ourselves as having created the world's best post-feudal system. And so I think that, it doesn't, how should I say, I wouldn't ask you to write it any differently than you did. I think your points are valid and they're good. But this is another factor. It wasn't just about orthodoxy. It was also a political fear that, oh my God, what's going to happen if we end up with an aristocracy again? In other words, and they understood really well how that works. In fact, Zhuangzi understands it, but that's another lecture. Yeah. You would know that anyway. Yeah. You would know it.
Yeah. You're making me think of something I've been translating for the last few days, a piece by Kang Youwei. After he's exiled, he wanders through Europe, and he has a beautiful meditation in the ruins of the Roman Senate. And wow. In it, he says, okay, everybody's agreed these days, he's writing in 1904, right, that constitutional monarchy and parliaments are the ideal, the way of the future, right? He sort of concedes one of these end of history arguments because that's what he really wants for China. But he says, however, the very existence of representative assemblies is a completely chancy thing. It has to do with the scale of the people. It has to do with how much land they occupy. It has to do with who can get control of resources. And so the Romans are our best example because at one moment they had a senatorial regime, and then they kind of flipped over into having an empire. And people didn't undergo an overnight conversion. It was just really geography of Rome plus all of its colonies suddenly coming home to roost because you couldn't administer a colonial system without having a tyrant at the middle. Yeah. Anyway, it's a really fascinating piece of somebody running through the counterfactuals of history and defying the kind of story that says, the British Magna Carta, the word of freedom has now gone forth to all people. And, you have only to accept it and obey. He's not buying that one bit. He honors the idea of constitutional monarchy. He likes that, but he says it's a totally chancy thing. We have to make it happen if it's going to happen. So anyway, I love this piece, and I hope to have a place to publish it before too long.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure, and I'll look forward to that.
Yeah, well, you mentioned corruption. I have enough people that I subvert and force to publish my stuff. I'm pulling your leg, of course. I don't have enough money to be honestly corrupt. In America these days, you really have to have a lot of money to corrupt people. The competition is, getting stiffer all the time.
Yeah, right. I wouldn't. You're the last person I would ever think of along those lines. I just wanted to mention you had mentioned Wang Anshi, and indeed that attitude, that critical attitude toward the classics, is again part of what is so fascinating about the song. So Xin Qiji also has a poem where he gets drunk. You probably know this one, and
I know,
and he says, he says the problem is I no longer feel the classics hold the answers anymore. And so I'm facing this world, and I no longer have the classics as a guide because I think it's bull. Right.
Yeah. Well, Wang Anshi, people have been, kicking him around for years as a kind of ignorant person who just made everything up on the spot. But in fact, what's going on with Wang Anshi much of the time is that he's saying, we can't just honor the classics. We have to have a rational basis. Maybe there are parts that we should rewrite in a new way. And so his adventures into etymology, that some people say, are just the product of an uneducated person, are, more like an attempt to make the Chinese language rational, the sort of thing that Leibniz would have been excited about another 600 years later.
He wasn't alone. Su Dongpo, likewise questions the classics, and the Guwen people. I like to call that the plain style. Because what they're imitating from the Han is not that it's ancient, but that it's plain, it's straightforward. But in any case, whatever. The Guwen people, often do that, and from Baiji onward. So that's again, that's there are limits to how far they would go, and I would also say, though, it seems to me that Han Yu's worst diatribes against the Buddhists were not often repeated. As you know, the Song period, ancient style people were quite positive about Buddhism.
Yeah, they could be, but then I think the conditions had changed enough that
they had. It was less threatening.
Interest represented for their times was a different thing. I'm seeing some good stuff coming up in the Q&A. Here we have Alan Dye asking, I wonder what your thoughts are about culture-based differentiation of peoples articulated by East Asian Pan-Asianists and nationalists during the late 19th and 20th centuries. Tongwen Tongdong comes to mind. Okay, and then there's some questions about whether these ideas of racial difference are modified by Western influenced ideas about social Darwinism and so on. Well, there's a lot of mixing of sources of ideas, but let's go back to people like Zhang Binglin, the great scholar who is also a rabid anti-Manchu activist, right? He says, we are as one with the Japanese because they still use our script. The Koreans, however, they've got their own script and we don't quite trust them. They know enough Chinese that I guess they can be with us. But as for Mongols, Manchus, Uyghurs, forget about it because they have a different script, right? Now, this is interesting because as far as I know, no one has proved that DNA is passed down by the script family that you used, right? So he's definitely not articulating a racism the way the European racists of 1900 were articulating it. And yet, he's drawing a very sharp frontier between us and them. So is he being influenced by language of kind of race war and social Darwinism and survival of the fittest and so on? Definitely, because he quotes a lot of people who have this notion that they're the yellow race, the white race, the black race, the red race, and so on, right? It was common parlance in the time that he was writing, and yet when it really comes down to it, who is with us and who is against us turns out to be a matter of script. And Zhang Taiyan was very dedicated to script. He's an etymologist. He's an archaeologist. He's for him, a script is really something that stays alive for thousands of years and continues to have effects. So it's a very curious situation. So I invite anybody who has the patience to read Zhang Binglin, because there's just such a curious mix of influences there. And he's writing it all in classical Chinese, of course, not giving vocabulary that sends you immediately to Herbert Spencer or somebody else. He's translating it into the eternal language. So that's a very good question that I think has a lot going on in it. Here's another one from Wen Zuoting. Okay. Oh, so nice of you to be in touch. Yeah, I remember you from my talk in Germany. It is so good to hear from you again. Yeah. So the role played by the quantity of surviving texts in the making of certain historical narratives, right? Yeah, okay. What survives after Yuan? What survives after Southern Song? What survives is what we read, right? Zoting says the Southern voices became even more dominant through translation into English and other languages. Yeah, I think this is certainly an issue about representation or representability. One other aspect that I want to include is the role of oral performance of literary texts, which is still going on in Tibet and Mongolia and other places, and yet which didn't have the prestige of written text, didn't get entertained in the same places. So I think always the text that survives is the lucky text. So I think that's kind of an essential boundary for what we can talk about. Okay, here comes a question, not a comment, from Jush Andy, whose PhD was on Polish literature translation into Chinese and Chinese literature translation into Polish in the 20th century. Yes, the idea of oppressed countries, right? 被压迫的国家 or 被压迫的民族. Lu Xun in the 1910s is editing a journal that publishes a lot of oppressed countries, including the people who are under the Tsarist yoke at the time, like the Poles. I think he saw the Chinese as being threatened by the same dynamic that was oppressing the Poles. Maybe not exactly the same people, but the same dynamic. So yeah, and Lu Xun would have got wind of this by living in Japan. So the Japan and China relation comes into here too as a complicating factor. But yes, there was absolutely a sense in the early 20th century that that Chinese in China were oppressed by the Manchus in the same way as other denizens of other empires were being oppressed. And there's a further note by the same person about how Central European literature shaped the political and social discourse. I think that's fair too. Yeah, that would be something to look at, case by case. But just reading this collection of oppressed people's literature edited by Lu Xun and Zhou Zuoren is really worth doing. Yeah, the sense of who is speaking for whom is, of course, always there in literary texts. Kang Youwei, whom I was just quoting as a great thinker of the kind of chancy nature of empires, is also someone who is completely unable to imagine Mongolia and Tibet being detached from China and going their own way. He writes a whole a lamentation about Mongolia and Tibet when in 1913 they sign a separate treaty that doesn't include the Chinese and makes favorable conditions for the Russians. So you could say, okay, Kang Youwei, he might be the great thinker of equality in some ways, but he's also the thinker of empire for whom the Qing Empire is the definitive form of China. Very, very, very funny stuff going on around here with these definitions of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And let's see, anonymous attendee says, I'm curious about how many languages does Professor Saucy comprehend? I would say over 2, at least 2. It depends on how much coffee I had. But you do what you can. Okay, another question. Another anonymous attendee who says, I wanted to ask how the literati's scorn for the unlearned and literary forms, such as the novel 小说 or 戏曲, is considered or not under the concept of the barbarian. Is the idea of 庶民 intersecting with the geographically marginal, given that folk culture is not always recorded by national histories of culture? Here, I think the boundary is kind of porous, right? Because I don't know, Martin, you would have a view on this through visual culture, but I think, the same people who enjoyed the most refined, exclusive, elite forms of culture were also reading novels and plays and, going to theater and watching puppet shows and whatnot. They might not put these things in the same drawer in their minds, but things could percolate back and forth. I mean, you think of, Hong Lo Meng is the greatest example of, to me, it's a kind of a tornado that picks up material from every possible origin and swirls it around and gives it a new set of meanings. And, I know that in painting, you, Marty, have written so memorably about things like the Qingming Festival painting and other ones where you have great mixing of classes and pursuits and so on. I think, you don't really see that in European art of anything like that time.
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment. Thanks for inviting me. I do think the emphasis on the arrogance of the literati is, at least in part, a product of Cold War scholarship. There was always the attempt to cram China into the early European model of a monarchy. They always treated it as if it was an aristocracy, when in fact it wasn't. And one of the keys, in fact, as you've suggested, Han, or as this question suggests, is how are the sort of the lower classes treated and thought of. I was just reading Spectator 106 last night, actually, and this is around 1710 or 17, around 1710, 11, Joseph Addison, where he talks about his friend who's an old knight, and how well he treats the servants, and how he treats them, like family rather than as servants and so on. This consciousness that shows up in England around that time, the early 18th century, is very similar to what happens in China in the Song. And so again, Su Rongpo has, regards the kindly and respectful treatment of servants as a mark of a truly educated person. As opposed to arrogance and so on, and so I think this is something that actually is worth studying. I've done some work on the way that servants are represented in Song painting, and again, they're shown relaxed. Sometimes they're even asleep. They have intelligent conversations between one another. These are things that are unimaginable, say, in that, like, the French artist who did that painting I showed. Right. But in England, again, around the early to mid 18th century, you start to get paintings of a lord, with his out hunting with his servant, and there's a new kind of a relaxed attitude between the lord and the servant, which you don't see in earlier work. Right. So this is certainly something worth looking further into. And just one final comment, the term 庶民 doesn't have, as you would be the first to tell us, Han, doesn't have a fixed meaning throughout Chinese history. So its meaning in the classical period, which was an aristocracy, is similar to commoner. But when you get into the Han or the Song or the Ming, it's a very different, it has a relationship to Min and other kinds of terms that zhong and other terms, which can be very complicated. So I wouldn't generalize much about shu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm also thinking about, Shakespeare did a lot for the moral consciousness of English people. I think, He's writing in an aristocratic world, and of course, the servants are always relegated to a subplot, but they get to speak. They get a chance to be people in their own right and to hold the stage for a while. And had it not been for Shakespeare, if the English had been condemned to have the kind of theatrical entertainments that they had in France, for example, maybe maybe the relations among the classes would have been more harsh. I don't know, just pure speculation here, but the Shakespearean sensibility for the underdog is kind of important and interesting. You see it surfacing later in things like Tristram Shandy, where Corporal Trim, who is the servant of Uncle Toby, and Corporal Trim is actually the dominant one in that partnership. He's the only person who has any sense, and he always keeps Uncle Toby out of trouble. I think that might be useful for thinking about that. But yeah, okay. Lionel Jensen, my friend from South Bend, Jiuyang, it's been so long. How jian? He says, I wondered if you might spare a few minutes to treat the audience to your reflections on the Gesar epic in light of China's Xi Jinping Xixiang's historical nihilism, an ideology that is grounded in an unalterable Han chauvinism. Well, I'm going to hope that Xi Jinpingism is just an interval, and that it will pass like many other things. In the book, I quote a speech by Xi Jinping where he says, "The Chinese people are great. They can do everything. For example, they made the Gesar epic." And you hear this, and you say, wait a minute, no, the Chinese didn't make the Gesar epic. In fact, they didn't even recognize its existence until the 1950s, when people began doing ethnographic research into so-called minorities. The Manchus were interested in the Gesar epic because it was kindred to their own epics, but certainly not the people who counted as Chinese in China. So this confiscation of Gesar as a kind of national cultural property somewhat scandalizes me. And I'm glad that the Gesar epic continues, but the cultural patronage that is applied to it doesn't necessarily preserve it in the freest possible form. It's kind of guided, and in any case, this appropriation is very, very troublesome. But yeah, so all oral epics are constantly being recomposed, and I suppose the Gesar epic is no different. I've read reports about versions of the Gesar that delete certain episodes that would be unpleasant for contemporary ideology, but I haven't gone to dig them up at first hand. In any case, it's one of those monumental productions of a culture that's on the borderlands of China, and to which Han Chinese really can't claim dominance or ownership. So yeah. I mean, I have another theory that I trot out in this book, that it might be the exclusion of epic that defines Chinese culture in some ways, right? Because so many other cultures have epics. And as you all know, they're horrible, bloody poems in which the ability to murder the maximum number of your opponents is glorified. Think of, even Odysseus, right? The Odyssey is mainly an adventure story, but it wouldn't be an epic without the murdering of the suitors and the handmaidens at the end. That's what brings it into the class of the epic. And, Chinese literati quite rightly said, this is a horrible thing to be celebrating, and making people sit for hours and hours listening to this stuff is probably not good for them. So I think they just instinctively shied away from epic and said, we're going to have our own art forms that convey messages that we think are important. So, just as, there are cultural zones where you might have, I don't know, vowel harmony, in the language, or you might have people who consume milk products and people who don't consume milk products, and you can sort of draw boundaries on the map between these. So those who use Epic and who do not use Epic, I think, are putting themselves in different categories. So we've reached 8:17. I think we're coming up to the predestined end of our conversation. Marty, it is wonderful to talk to you. I envy you, your opportunity to travel to far climes and meet more people. I look forward to your return to Hyde Park so we can talk with you some more.
That would be great. No, and I enjoyed this very much, and as always, learned a lot from you.
Nani, uganda.
Thank you very much, Professors Hans Sasse and Martin Powers, and the book, The Making of Barbarians, Chinese Literature and Multilingual Asia and China and England, the pre-industrial struggle for justice in word and image.
They're not really on the one hand, on the other hand, are they? They're both in one hand.
We hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in previously held book talks, there's actually a CS YouTube channel where you can see a recorded book talks and other events from years past. And there's going to be a link to the channel in the chat box. So thank you all again. This brings us to the end of our program. So have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Chelsea, for keeping us in line.